The paper I'm presenting this evening is The Pediatric Obesity Epidemic Continues Unabated in Bogalusa, Louisiana. This study by Broyles and Associates was published in the journal Pediatrics in 2010. This study was based on data collected from the Bogalusa Heart Study. I became aware of the Bogalusa Heart Study in a documentary from HBO called The Weight of the Nation, and all 4 parts of that documentary are available for you on YouTube. The obesity epidemic has not just been in adults. Certainly there's also been a profound increase in obesity and overweight in children. And this may be of greater concern because of the long-term health consequences on the developing body. Most of the data that we see reports national trends, and very few reports are on these subgroups, these populations that are at high risk, such as the rural South. At the time of this particular publication in 2010, the author said it was unclear if childhood obesity levels were plateauing, although the CDC has been reporting as such. So this is current data from the CDC stating that about 17% of children had obesity, and however that the age group from 2 to 5 saw a decrease between 2003, 2004, and 2011 and 12. So we can see that on a national level, perhaps these numbers are decreasing, but that may not be an adequate representation of what's really happening from community to community. There are the numbers on the right column based on race and also broken out by age group. And the older children do tend to have higher rates of obesity and overweight, and that was also reported in this study. And this study examined the time points of the Bogalusa Heart Study, and also extended it to the most recent data collections from 2008 and 2009. They used cross-sectional data from 8 time points, and they used this to describe trends in obesity, overweight in the rural South. And if you recall from a presentation earlier in this semester, the CDC has county maps for rates of obesity, and the rural South definitely has a high prevalence of obesity and overweight in their population. So it makes sense that they would study this particular subgroup. So their stated objective was to examine 35-year trends in the prevalence of overweight and obesity among children and adolescents in Bogalusa, Louisiana. So the Bogalusa Heart Study was a long-term community-based study out of Tulane University. It was looking at the natural history of cardiovascular disease and progression from childhood into adulthood. Now, Bogalusa has a stable biracial population. It hasn't changed significantly. However, we will see later that the changes did not seem to have any effect on the levels of obesity. Children were examined between 1973 and 2009, and they did 7 cross-sectional surveys between 73 and 84 on children less than 18. And there were several clinical assessments, but they were not discussed in this paper. The Bogalusa Heart Study is a very robust study, and there have been many reports, studies based on the data, and even a book. This particular study used the most recent clinical BMI measurements for the children in grades 6 through 8 and 9 through 12. I will point out as a side note that the age range seems to be surprising to me, but in 6 through 8 they're saying ages 11 through 16, and in 9 through 12 ages 15 through 20. So I don't know that you can call 20-year-old students children any longer, but they were not included in the study. They were only utilizing data from children less than 18. So Bogalusa itself in 1973 was a community of about 20,000 people, 65% white and 35% black, and changed over time. In 2008, a community of 13,000 people, and 57% white and 41% black. So there were definitely some changes. And in 2008, the children under 18 were 45% white and 55% black. Now, the study itself started with about 24,000 observations from we'll say about 12,000 children and adolescents in that age range. The repeated cross-sectional design resulted in 5,294 observations. 2,923 were measured twice, 1,841 children were measured 3 times, and 1,595 children were measured 4 or more times. That's Gerald Berenson, MD. He is the director of this study, and he also authored a book, The Bogalusa Heart Study, Evolution of Cardiometabolic Risk from Childhood to Middle Age, published by Springer in 2011. So the height and weight measurement techniques were reported, and they did a nice job of explaining how they collected this data in clinical measurements as well as certainly in the surveys. The BMI gender specific and BMI for age z-scores or standard scores were calculated using the Center for Disease Control and Prevention growth charts. They calculated normal weight as being below the 85th percentile, between overweight and obese equal to or above the 85th percentile, or obese being equal to or more than the 95th percentile. And this study examined these time points, so these eight time points and trends from the Bogalusa Heart Study, starting in 1973 and up to 2009. And there does seem to be quite a gap there. So it looks like they collected a lot of data and then maybe didn't after. So they computed the survey mean and the mean BMI collected in clinical measurement, the standardized scores or the z-scores, and they computed those scores using generalized estimating equations in SAS, which helped to account for the repeated measures of some participants. The age distribution and the proportion of black to white students were adjusted with regression models, and they stratified the least square means, which were reported, across age group specific prevalence. So the secular trends over time were estimated by linear or additive model, so they could assess properly the change in risk over time. And the differences in rates of increase in both age and between black and white were compared to the group times time interaction to make sure that the data was being analyzed and reported properly. Then they compared that data to the US trends from NHANES data. They used the survey cycles from 71 through 75, and then NHANES 2, 76 through 80, NHANES 3, 88 to 94, and then they also used the NHANES data points in 1999 to 2000, 2003 to 4, 2001 to 2, 5 to 6, and 7 to 8. Forgive my lack of proper order there. The BMI status of overweight and obese children and adolescents were calculated from this data using the same methods that they utilized for the data collected in Bogalusa. And they limited the survey samples to population from the same age group. So although the NHANES data extended those years, they only used ages 5 to 17 to compare. And the prevalences and the standard errors were estimated using estimated sample weights, in SAS. I'm not familiar with SAS. So they reported results that the mean BMI increased from 18.2 to in 1973 and 74 to 23.8 in 2008-2009. So there was an increase of about 1.5 BMI units per decade. The proportion of overweight and obese children increased quite a lot, from 14.2 in 1973-74 to 48.4 in 2008-2009. The increase in overweight obesity was 9.6% per decade. The increase in obesity, or over that 95th percentile, was 6.6%. And the changes were more significant in ages 10 and older compared with children less than 10. And so there are the p-values reported, and they were all significant in the age groups. So here are some graphs that paint the picture, the unfortunate picture. So this is the changes in overweight, including obese, from ages 5 to 17, as being overweight or obese in Bogalusa from 1973 to 2009. So we can see that that is an alarming trend. And this is the percentage of obese children in that population, discounting overweight. And so again, we just see that, and take a look, there don't appear to be differences, went the wrong way, differences between gender or race. It really is just time. The time is the factor. And same here. So in both overweight and obese, and the children just classified as obese. Now here is the data in Bogalusa compared to the NHANES data. Overweight including obese, we see why NHANES and CDC are reporting one thing as a national level, but that's not what's happening in this community. And there's the graph portraying the percentage of obese children in Bogalusa compared to to the NHANES data in 2009. And so we can see again where they're probably reporting this. Now this is a group of children from 5 to 17, so this does not, these graphs don't break it out by age range except for the total population. So the rates have increased dramatically in Bogalusa in the last 35 years. Overweight obesity has more than tripled, from 14.2% to 48.4%, and the proportion of obese children has increased more than 5-fold. And that is where some professionals are stating that that is the biggest concern, is the levels of morbid obesity that have increased. And so that is a trend that deserves more attention. It didn't seem to matter at all what age groups, boys and girls, white and black, youth, all didn't appear to have any protection against this risk. Now, the prevalence may provide some evidence that maybe some communities are reaching levels of obesity that have not been predicted to happen for 10 years or more. So there have been predictions as to what would happen if current trends continued. And what we're seeing in this population, and apparently in populations very similar, that these populations have already reached that crisis level that has been predicted. We weren't expecting to see it for another decade. Now this does not support the NHANES observations of a plateau in this age group. Yes, perhaps in ages 2 to 5 and maybe in certain communities, but not necessarily in all communities. So they discussed, in their discussion, they said they were attributing the possible differences between these data sets maybe due in part to what they say the NHANES relatively small sample size and complex sampling scheme. And let me elaborate on that a little bit, although I'm not as familiar with NHANES as probably many of you are. But they use an example that in 2005 to 2006, although 16.3% of children in that age range were estimated to be obese, the 95% confidence interval ranged from 13 to 19.6%. And so perhaps there were not enough samples to have an appropriate amount of confidence in the results. But they also suggested that it just may be that some communities are at higher risk. And so they did some similar studies in other Louisiana rural areas where they took measurements from 2,700 children ages 8 to 15 from 43 different schools in different parts of Louisiana. And in 2006, they found that 45.1% of the children were overweight and obese, and 27.4% were technically obese. Um, Certainly, they could be attributed to higher poverty, to less healthy food access, and physical activity opportunities in rural areas, which honestly confuses me. So I put an author's note in here that we talk a lot about how in urban areas that children may not have playgrounds and places to play, or they're not safe to go outside, but in rural areas, and even in Louisiana, which is maybe not a lot of fun in the summertime, but there tend to be open places to climb trees and go outside and play kick the can and ride your bike. I don't guess I quite understand that as being a limitation of the environment as much as a limitation of the society. And also in rural areas in Louisiana, you can have a garden and people hunt. So that's access to clean, healthy food. So again, I think that this may be more socialization than the actual environment itself. Research does indicate, however, that children in non-metropolitan areas are at a greater risk for weight gain. And that's even after adjusting for socioeconomic status. There are no systematic differences in race and gender, although black boys had the lowest rate of obesity and overweight at almost all times in the study. But really, there weren't any significant differences and no other trends were reported. It may be a phenomena of rural areas. And there may be it may be that people do have similar behaviors in these areas, and there may be smaller differences in the overall levels of activity in these populations. Whereas in a city, some people may be highly active and others more sedentary. In this case, it may be that the entire population has adopted a similar lifestyle. So they stated their one limitation as being lack of specific socioeconomic data, but then they immediately rebutted that limitation, stating that according to the U.S. Census, poverty level was stable across time in that area in Bogalusa. It was 37% in 1990 and actually reduced to 33% in 2000. So it wasn't a huge shift in poverty level. So based on that, they stated that the trends did not appear to be due to economic changes, and supported that with the additional information that race and poverty are quote unquote highly regulated, which I guess is a specific way of saying it, in Bogalusa. Basically 48% of blacks and 21% of whites live in poverty, and that apparently remains stable. So although it is not necessarily just or equivalent, it is highly regulated. Overweight and obesity were the same in black and white children, even though black children experience more poverty in Bogalusa. But looking back at the previous slide, the male black children had the lower rates of obesity across all time points, even though they experienced significantly more poverty. So that indicates that overweight and obesity were the same in black and white children, independent of socioeconomic status. So this study concluded that the 35-year trends in overweight and obesity in the rural South continues to grow in children, and illuminating the differences between the national data and the community data. They stated emphatically, obesity is not plateauing in children in this community or in similar communities, and that we have to be careful of backing off on our efforts based on national data reports. And I will comment that the study that I originally pulled about the Bogalusa heart study I found was published in an open source journal with an impact factor of 0, so I really didn't get into it. Although I was really hoping to be able to present it, because they were stating that based on the data collected in the Bogalusa heart study, that diet and activity levels could only account for 15% of the difference in risk for obesity. That 85% of what may be contributing to this is unknown or unmeasured at this point. I don't know of the veracity of that study or their data or their interpretations, but I have been studying the social psychology of physical activity and inactivity for the last few years. Honestly, for a class that I designed on the topic. And there isn't a lot published about the social psychology of physical activity and obesity. And I'm beginning to believe strongly that there are some basic tenets that are studied in social psychology, like conformity and priming, and other unconscious responses to the environment that may be playing a part that we're just not looking at, and that maybe putting some effort into changing the environment in a way that is not necessarily the built environment as we would typically think parks and swing sets, although that's certainly helpful, but to also take a look at the basic uh, construct of the human unconscious and how we may be responding to what's happening in our neighbors and our friends. And we may just be adapting to what is around us because that is a natural human response. So it's just a thought. I don't have any answers. The more I study, the more questions I have. But these things are studied in social psychology and I think deserve a little bit more of an in-depth look. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening. If I'm on FaceTime, I will be happy to take your questions.